introduce the keynote speaker for our webinar. He is a Christian brother who taught me in school and with whom I lived in community for several years. Needless to say, he has had a strong impact on my life as a brother. Brother Gabriel Thomas has always had a heart for the disadvantaged and poor, and so it was not surprising that he volunteered and was part of the first community to start a rural mission in a village called Mandal in Gujarat, India, among the indigenous people. He says that he couldn't help but notice that their beginnings were very much like Edmund's in Waterford. He started, that's Edmund, started in a stable while we started in a hut. The children were in rags and always hungry, much like Edmund's boys. We fed them, clothed them, and then educated them. The change was swift and noticeable. Soon boys from the neighboring villages joined in, and also the girls. We had started something new in the brothers. A vernacular school, a co-educational school, and a rural village school. When Gabriel Thomas finished his term in Mandal, he asked for a sabbatical and came to Ireland to walk in the footsteps of Edmund, from Callan to Limerick to Ennis to Ennistimon to Cork, and then to Dublin, Marino, the archives there, to Synge Street, Francis Street, St. James Street, O'Connell schools. A big influence in his appreciation for the person of Edmund was his meeting with Dare Keogh, who fascinated him and kept him for 2 hours talking when their meeting was scheduled for half an hour. So today, Gabes, as he's affectionately known, is joining us from Waterford, where he is now based at the Holy Founder's Place, in his house and at his mausoleum in the Blessed Edmund Rice Chapel. Gabes, all of us are waiting eagerly for your insights into the person of Edmund the Advocate. And I now invite you to begin your presentation.
Thank you, Tino. And welcome to all the participants in the webinar. I begin with the penal laws in Ireland as they applied to the Catholics. The penal laws began in late 17th century, forbade schools for Catholic children. Schooling was an agency of the English conquest of Ireland by the Tudors, with a view to spreading the English language and the Protestant faith. A couple 100,000 Protestants had all the power, all the privilege, as against 4 to 6 million Catholics who were growing constantly in numbers. The Protestants had the parliament to themselves. The Catholics had not even the right to vote. They could not enter the professions, could not be members of town or city corporations. And though the Catholic Emancipation Act had been passed in 1829, Daniel O'Connell, the liberator, wrote an open letter to the people of England published in the Morning Chronicle, the 19th of May, 1836, describing the condition of Catholics here in Ireland. The state of Ireland is this. Upon a population of 8 million, there are existing more than 2,300,000 beggars, living on alms, supported by charity. Yes, after 35 years of union with the richest country in the world, more than 1/4 of the population of Ireland are actual beggars. The Rice children received their early education from an Augustinian friar, Patrick Grace, known as the Little Grey Friar on account of his premature grayness. In time, Edmund was sent to the local hedge school in Moat Lane in Carroll, in County Kilkenny. The school catered to 30 students who were taught individually, and the greatest part of the day was spent writing, that's copying headlines, and rehearsing or learning by rote. Edmund graduated to a Mr. White's school in Kilkenny, where he received a classical education, which usually included English, writing, grammar, globes, maps, drawing, and sometimes Latin. Such schools provided a thorough grounding in commercial subjects, mathematics, and bookkeeping. This education fitted Edmund for his subsequent apprenticeship to his uncle Michael Rice, a prosperous merchant in the city of Waterford. Under the direction of his uncle, Edmund honed his business skills. The earliest recollection of him, which attests to his standing as one of Waterford's leading merchants, comes from Brother Austin Dunphy, a native of Callan, who would become his assistant. Quote, "He was respected and trusted by men of all creeds and classes." End quote. Almost all recollections are in agreement on his keen business sense. His commercial integrity was noted too. Quote, "In buying and selling, his probity and uprightness was noticed." End quote. He learned that a man was as good as his word, a maxim that would direct his life. More recollections refer to his sense of humor, a vital asset in trade. Other recollections recall his piety and how he would say his rosary as he traveled to fairs. In possibly 1785, Edmund married. However, no details of his marriage survive other than newspaper announcements of the tragic death of his wife in January 1789. Died at Ballybricken, the wife of Mr. Rice. It is reasonable to accept that she died in a fever which swept Europe in 1789. That dreaded fever which Dorothy Herbert claimed, quote, "raged all over the world and carried off millions in every quarter of the globe." End quote. Little is known of Mary, Edmund's daughter. There is a general awareness of her existence and her presence in Waterford, Callan, and finally in Carrickshire until her death in 1859. She is remembered as delicate, but not of unsound mind, unbalanced or crippled or deformed. She was strong enough to live 70 years, considerably beyond the average Irish life expectancy at the time of 38 years. Throughout his life, Edmund paid for the care of his daughter, and his accounts for 1826 reveal that she was maintained at the expense of £16 per annum, which was equivalent to a teacher's salary. This double tragedy was to play a pivotal role in Edmund's heightened religious and social consciousness, coupled with a growing sense of a religious vocation. About the year 1790, at the age of 38, he joined a pious association of young men in Waterford under the influence of the Jesuits, centered on St. Patrick's Chapel. Its members were committed to living more active Christian lives, promoting private prayer, spiritual reading, the practice of charity, and the frequent reception of the sacraments of the Eucharist and confession. Edmund was a daily communicant since this time, and devotion to the Blessed Sacrament remained a defining hallmark of his spirituality. The most significant step in Edmund's spiritual development came in 1791, when he subscribed to a Dublin imprint of the Douay Bible. This was a critical moment in his formation and is suggestive of the extent to which Edmund accepted the radical challenge at the heart of the gospel. In a very striking way, Matthew 25:34-40, that is the Last Judgment, became the constant yardstick against which Edmund measured his actions. Its spirit is implicit in the most frequently quoted of Edmund's expressions, in which he reminded a friend that, quote, were you to know the merit and value of only going from one street to another to serve a neighbor for the love of God, we would prize it more than silver or gold. End quote. Edmund's concern for social justice and his commitment to the poor was evident in his involvement in a number of charitable societies in Waterford. In 1793, Edmund was among the founder members of the Trinitarian Orphan Society, where 100 boys and girls were housed and educated. In the following year, 1794, during a time of particular famine and distress in the city, Edmund was one of the founders, if not the initiator, of the Waterford Society for Visiting and Relieving Distressed Shopkeepers, a group not unlike the St. Vincent de Paul Society. He also had a particular concern for the plight of prisoners, whom he visited and assisted materially, providing them with food and small funds to help relieve the misery of hunger and overcrowding. This was to be a constant feature of his life and a special apostolate of the early brothers. Contemporary reports commented that the brothers were ever to be found administering to the prisoners and alleviating their sufferings. Many of the memoirs recall Edmund's visits to the cells and how he escorted condemned men to the gallows. Quote, "This was a special privilege extended to Brother Rice, as he was credited with having a wonderful power of moving to repentance some of those hardened people who seemed callous when appealed to by the clergy even." Contemporary reports highlight the misery of the prisons, but the brothers were ever to be found administering to the prisoners and alleviating their sufferings. In the Asiatic cholera pandemic of 1832, which claimed 25,000 Irish lives, the brothers made their monasteries and schools in Dungarvan, in Thurles, in Limerick available as temporary hospitals. In the Great Famine of 1847, the brothers responded to the misery around them. The annals of the North Monastery record Brother John Baptist Leonard feeding 300 starving children a day in Cork during the famine. In Dublin, brothers from Francis Street attended to the fever patients in the hospital at Kilmainham. There are two striking accounts of individual beneficiaries of Edmund's charity towards a stranger. The first concerns the young Italian immigrant Charles Bianconi, who met Edmund in 1806. Edmund taught him English, encouraged him to be industrious, careful, and sober. His interest and advice deeply affected the young man's life. Edmund's assistance went beyond simple counsel, and he helped him to secure business premises in Clonmel, 1808. In time, Bianconi developed an extensive transport system. He was twice elected mayor of Clonmel, and he played a prominent role in the establishment of the Catholic University of Dublin, 1854. Each year, he sent £50 and 20 suits of clothes for poor boys. The second beneficiary was a black slave boy, whom Edmund bought from a ship's master on the quay in Waterford. Edmund entrusted him to the care of the Presentation Sisters. Later, Edmund helped him buy his own premises in the Grace Due area of the city, not far from where I'm sitting at the moment. In time, the boy, whose legal name was John Thomas, succeeded in business, and on his death, his property, consisting of 2 houses, was left between the Christian Brothers and the Presentation Sisters. Edmund's actions anticipated the abolition of the slave trade by almost a decade, and the emancipation of British slaves by 30 years. The liberation of a slave serves as a metaphor for the liberty he would later bring to the poor of Waterford through the power of education. In particular, Edmund sought out those who were most in need, for it was about this time that he accepted the responsibility to care for the orphaned Connolly sisters. Their parents had died when they were very young. Edmund lodged money given him on their behalf in a bank that became involved in financial difficulties and failed, and the money for the orphan girls was thus lost. But Edmund made good the loss from his own private funds and had the Connolly girls reared and educated at his own expense. Edmund's decision to completely reorient his life and dedicate his extensive wealth to the apostolate of Christian education was generated following the tragic death of his young wife. This was the original heartquake, which unleashed within Edmund a compelling compassion to act on behalf of his dear little ones. Those who knew him recognized that compassion for the poor and the afflicted was one of the precious heirlooms our founder left to us, his children. Such a perspective is strongly embedded in the oral tradition of the Waterford people. Quote, Brother Rice was very kind, pious, and religious, who so interested himself in little children that he used to grieve when he saw them in a poor and neglected condition. His charity and love for little children urged him to devote his time and his property to render them all the assistance that it was possible to give. End quote. In 1802, Edmund started the first religious congregation of men in modern times to be founded by a layman for the education of poor boys, something for which there was no precedent in English-speaking Catholicism. What Edmund constantly witnessed were grown and wild youths on the streets, as well as the poor boys along the quays of Waterford, who were the object of his compassion. The earliest historical account of the foundation of the congregation, known as Origin, attributed to Brother Austin Dumfie and dated to 1829, describes the first 20 years of its history from 1802 to the general chapter of 1822. It provides first-hand account of Edmund's decision to teach the poor. Quote, in the year 1793, Mr. Edmund Rice of the city of Waterford formed the design of erecting an establishment for the gratuitous education of poor boys. From this time forward, Mr. Rice did not lose sight of the object he had in view, though from various causes he did not commence the building till the year 1802. Waterford was well served for schools. The common perception is that Edmund founded his congregation in Waterford in order to care for the poor boys of the city for whom nobody else cared. The reality, however, was quite the contrary. Edmund was not simply concerned with the provision of education, but rather of an emphatically Catholic education as an alternative to the schooling on offer in the city. The issue at stake was of offering opportunities and alternatives to Catholic children. In a sense, Edmund was expressing sentiments similar to those articulated by Daniel O'Connell 20 years later. The Liberator had declared, "Let the Protestants educate their own children as they choose. All that Catholics ask is to be allowed the same privilege." The school at Mount Sion, Barrack Street, Waterford, opened its doors on the 1st of May, 1804. The brothers' charity extended beyond the provision of education. Edmund's school attended to the physical needs of the boys as well. A small bakehouse was built to provide poorer children with a daily meal of bread and milk. For many years too, a tailor was employed at Mount Sion, repairing tattered clothes and distributing suits to the poor. Edmund's kindness to the children was proverbial. He appeared one day walking through the streets of Waterford, 4 boys with him and one of them in his arms. "Brother Rice," he was asked, "where are you taking these boys?" The answer was, "I am taking them to Mount Zion to have them go to school and to give them bread." The 3 spiritual characteristics underpinning Edmund's advocacy of children and his apostolate are contained in the logo of the congregation today. Today, that logo consists of 3 words: presence, compassion, liberation, which summarize what Edmund was about. Firstly, presence. Edmund had a profound belief in the equal dignity of persons. His statement of faith was contained in the 1822 chapter directions. Quote, "They," the brothers, "are to have a tender affection for all children, especially the poorest, as most resembling our Lord Jesus Christ." End quote. The atmosphere in the schools reflected faith in the presence of the divine. A government report quotation here: "Religion is the leading principle, nay, the very spirit which guides and directs their whole education system." Government Report 1870. In first describing his system of education in 1810, Edmund laid emphasis on religious education aimed at nourishing heart and mind. Quote, "The good seed will grow up in the children's heart later on." He acknowledged the difficulty and effort needed to be put in by the teachers. "It is most laborious," in quotes, "for the teachers. However, if it were 10 times what it is, I must own we are amply repaid in seeing such a reformation in the children." End quote. Secondly, compassion. The cultivation of compassionate care was the fundamental hallmark of the first generation of Christian brothers, where the brothers were perceived as caring fathers. They succeeded in drawing, quote, "poor pupils to a steady application to their school and other duties, more in a spirit of love than of fear." End quote. The schools were intimate institutions where children were cared for in a wholesome, family-like atmosphere. Edmund fed, clothed, and shod his poor boys because of his compassion. He welcomed daily his dear little ones with a fatherly, personal handshake. This intimate culture was reported at a government inquiry. "Nowhere have I seen between master and scholars so much ease and confidence, I might say paternal and filial affection reciprocated, as between the Christian brothers and their pupils." Edmund opened his schools firstly to those who were unimportant, poor and neglected, who lacked power and influence. But he also recognized that not all who were neglected were poor. In the developed world, where material luxuries are abundant, there are often young who have lost all sense of meaning in life, often living in spiritual poverty. It is this poverty that starves compassion. End quote. The pupils served by Christian brother schools were taught that they had an obligation to serve their neighbors and to respond to their needs. Consequently, it is not surprising that the lion's share for the financial support of Mount Zion's mission to the poor of Waterford in a short time came from past pupils. Christian brother education believes service to the people of God is fundamentally an obligation of justice, not charity. Compassion compels action to redress tyranny and oppression. Edmund's education sought to challenge and transform conditions determining oppression. Thirdly, liberty. Edmund chose a relevant practical curriculum for his students. He educated them in enriched surroundings and fed and clothed them. He opted to offer a quality education of relevance and did not aspire to accepted benchmarks of excellence, a concept equated in his time with the provision of classical education. Such an irrelevant education would not liberate his students. He provided a critical education with the provision of textbooks, introducing his pupils to Irish history and culture. Likewise, the mixing of students from every social class in his schools honored the equal dignity of persons. While social justice may not have been a curriculum component, its axioms were taught and they were learned. Edmund Rice schools were considered members of an extended family, and as a result, honored obligations to other family members as well as their immediate own. Edmund Rice schools were expected to think beyond their local boundaries and contribute elsewhere where the need was greater. That meant that individual schools, especially comfortable schools, were not to be self-focused, but were obliged to assist and contribute to the common good, especially initiatives where the poor and marginalized needed ministering. Sobriety. Sobriety had been a constant theme in Edmund's teaching. One of the anecdotes which survive about him concerns a Waterford alcoholic and prostitute, Paul Carthy, who begged him for help. She promised that if he would help her, she would go to Cork and take the pledge of teetotalism from Father Theobald Matthew, the apostle of temperance. There and then, he brought her to a draper, fitted her for the journey. She walked to Cork and back. Her life subsequently was as edifying as previously it was notorious. Within the schools, too, he encouraged temperance. Many of the memories of Edmund Rice recall his kindness to the children of alcoholics, how he took special care of them, while at the same time seeking out their parents and urging them to lead a better, more sober life. Edmund Rice and Father Matthew had been friends for 40 years. The brothers played a crucial part in Father Matthew's temperance crusade. The brothers were, in John Shelley's words, men of the world and who had embraced the cause of regeneration in society, and as such exercised an influence vastly disproportionate to their small numbers. Such sentiments were confirmed by the Endowed Schools Commission, which acknowledged the, quote, extraordinary personal influence exerted by the teachers, the quality of their training, and the efficacy of their organization and discipline. The superiority of the schools was attributed to the character of the brothers, who devoted their lives to the cause of education for no private or personal gain, but as a sacred and self-imposed duty. Throughout his life, the defining characteristic of Edmund's spirituality had been his trust in divine providence. Providence is our inheritance. During one legal battle, he confided to a brother, "The Lord gave and the Lord taketh away, so blessed be his name forever and ever." That should be our motto. Age had not dimmed his interest in school, and while he was able to move about, he would visit the classrooms to encourage both teachers and boys. Many of the memories of this period recall his kindness as he passed through the school. One of the brothers later described these visits, quote, "He would speak in his own kindly and affable manner to groups of reverent youngsters who would invariably try to get as near as possible to whom they loved as a father and revered as a saint. His pleasure in hearing the little ones say the prayers and answer the catechism was delightful to observe. The pupils had equally fond memories of these visits. Years later, Patrick Brown recalled his childhood in Mount Sion in the 1830s and how the boys had such veneration for Brother Rice that they regarded it as a privilege to get a look at him. Another remembered him as a homely, fatherly man, while John Flynn described his paternal care for the boys. He was very affectionate and kind to the children. When leaving school, the boys shook hands with him. Accompanied by a brother, he would walk through the grounds of Mount Sion. He would exhort his helper to greater devotion to the Blessed Virgin. One of these helpers, Aloysius Hoare, he would later go on to be the 4th Superior General, remembered the advice he had been given. Quote, "Have great devotion to our Blessed Lady. Say in her honor the Memorare, and she will take care of you and obtain for you the crowning grace of final perseverance." He read the Bible each day and the life of Teresa of Avila. And I come to the last portion of my presentation, the final years. And the final years are 1841 to 1844. At Christmas 1841, Edmund's health failed. And there seemed no hope of recovery. Michael Paul Reardon, Edmund's successor as Superior General, notified the various communities of their founder's condition. Quote, "With feelings of pain and sorrow, I have to inform you that our most dear Brother Ignatius Rice has been unusually ill since Christmas. He has no pain or uneasiness, but great weakness, which confines him to his bed, and will, it is feared, end in his dissolution. I request you to have the prayers of the community offered to beg for him the grace of a happy death." He rallied briefly, but before long he was confined to his room. His mental faculties began to fail, and he lived in a semi-coma. From 1842, he required the constant attention of a nurse. So regular his pattern of prayer throughout his life been, that his first words on awakening each morning were, "Praise be to you, O Christ." In August 1844, Edmund's health showed signs of rapid deterioration. He was anointed on the morning of the 28th of August, and the brothers joined in prayerful vigil around his bedside. He died the following morning, the 29th of August. He was 82 years of age. Brother Joseph Murphy, Superior of Mount Sion, wrote, quote, "His life was a long series of sufferings, labors, and contradictions under which he manifested a great soul and which betokened sublime virtue." End quote. In the absence of Michael Paul Reardon, who was in England on visitation, he notified the various communities of his passage. "We have the sorrowful duty of announcing to you the death of our most dear father, founder, and brother Ignatius Rice, who died at 11 o'clock this morning after having received the last sacraments. We trust he is gone to receive the reward of his labor for the poor, for the congregation, and for us all." End quote. Bishop Nicholas Foran, who visited Edmund regularly during his illness, presided at the solemn Requiem Mass and final obsequies at Mount Sion on Saturday, the 31st of August, 1844. 29 priests joined the bishop at the altar. Edmund's body dressed in the simple habit of the congregation, with beads and a crucifix in his hands, was placed in the small oratory at Mount Zion. The brothers prayed by his side, and the leading citizens of Waterford, with a great number of people, came to pay their last respects. After the Mass, his remains were interred on the monastery grounds, and their spot was marked with a simple stone cross. The Bishop of Waterford set aside the 1st of October as the month's mind for a great public thanksgiving for the life of Edmund Rice. Bishop Foran presided and was joined at the altar by 50 priests, including Father Theobald Matthew, who traveled from Cork for the occasion. Among the Christian brothers who assembled to pay their respects to their founder were 35 members of the congregation from the schools in England. At his death, there were 11 communities of brothers in Ireland, 12 in England, and 1 in Sydney, Australia, educating between them 8,000 boys. This represented a tiny fraction of the Irish population of 8 million. 70 Christian brothers exercised an influence which was entirely disproportionate to their numbers. It was their exceptional reputation as teachers and the quality of their lives which inspired the eulogies of Edmund Rice and placed him alongside Daniel O'Connell and Theobald Matthew as the great men of the 19th century Ireland. His brothers were pioneers in establishing the foundations of universal elementary education in Ireland, the elimination of tuition fees which had restricted Catholic access in education. The methodologies which Rice perfected were ideally suited to the employment needs of 19th century Ireland. With their uniform standards and emphasis on work discipline, his large schools were to education what the factories were to the industrial age. This revolution in education facilitated the modernization of Irish society, as the brothers formed a disciplined, literate workforce from the ranks of the rough masses. This achievement was celebrated by contemporaries who lauded the extent to which the monks had withdrawn multitudes from the dangers of idleness and vice, promoting instead the pursuit of useful knowledge and the habits of virtuous and honorable industry. For this moral elevation, Edmund Rice was praised as Ireland's De La Salle. At his centenary too, preachers would hail him as the island's Don Bosco. He was beatified by Pope John Paul II in 1996. Deliverance became the theme of the obituaries of Edmund Rice, whom the patriot Thomas Francis Maher, 1823 to 1867, eulogized him as the preceptor, the patriarch, and the prophet. Alongside O'Connell, he was celebrated as a benefactor of his race, not only of the present generation, but of the future. This was Edmund Rice's achievement. It was not the remarkable accomplishments of his troubled life which signaled his greatness. It was rather what the great project promised for the future. He was not the liberator, but a prophet. Quote, the herald of a new age of Irishmen. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening to me.